Well, it's a day that ends in Y, and that means it's time for yet another study about whether or not our delicate youths are being negatively affected by this proliferation of a scary new technology, scrolls. Wait, no, I'm sorry, I mean books. No, radio. Wait, motion pictures. TV. No, I've got it. It's video games. Video games are ruining society, just like all those other things were thought to ruin society prior to it. Prior to people just accepting those things as a regular part of our society. That's not to say that one of those things hasn't ruined our society. I mean, would Donald Trump be president right now if television was never invented? Great question. Sure, we wouldn't have Breaking Bad or The Wire, but maybe we would have something just as good in its place. Tough to say. Media has an impact on us, both in good ways and in bad ways. It can make us care more about some important issues. It can teach us about other people outside of our worldview, or it could convince us to care less about certain issues, to completely change our perspective on other people to the negative. And it's also not to say that just because people always say a new technology is going to cause the downfall of society, that means that a new technology in the future can never cause the downfall of society. Video games in particular are interesting because they are leaps and bounds ahead of television and movies and books in terms of how personally invested you can get into them. For instance, you can easily get lost in a good book, but a video game requires you to make decisions and actually affect what is happening on the screen. So how couldn't that have an impact on a person, possibly even more than a good book? So despite joking around about this topic, I actually do think it's worthwhile to study video games and how they affect people. The most recent study I've seen comes out of Singapore, where psychologists looked at a big old chunk of kids, more than 3,000 kids around the age of 11 who were followed for 2 years. Now, this is an existing data set that has been used in previous research on violence in video games. And those previous studies did tend to find connections between violent video games and real life violence. However, those previous studies on this data set have been criticized for possible researcher bias and just bad statistics. It's a lot of data, so that's a good thing. It's good to have a lot of data, but it also makes it easier for researchers to either purposefully or unknowingly manipulate the statistics in order to find effects that might not actually be there. I've talked about this before. It's called p-hacking. And when you have a huge data set, you can go in without a specific hypothesis and just look for statistical blips and decide that those are your results. But this study was pre-registered, which just means that before they even started their research, they submitted their hypothesis and their analytic strategy to a journal, so that they can't go back later and say, oh, wait, we didn't find statistical significance there. We found it in this other place. The other cool thing about pre-registration is that once it's accepted by a journal, that journal can't then reject the study for failing to find an interesting result. That's been an ongoing problem in published science because it can lead to a lack of replication. Replication is kind of boring if you're just finding the same result or if you don't find a result at all. And it prioritizes studies that are flashy with big headlines over studies that might be really useful. While the previous studies did find some suggestion that violence in video games led to violence in real life, this pre-registered study found absolutely no correlation at all. And they were looking at several possible outcomes, including aggressive actions, aggressive fantasies, and cyberbullying. Interestingly, they also looked at some nonsensical outcomes or traits that are already known to have no correlation to violent video games because it would be nonsense if they did. For instance, one of them was age of the child when they moved to Singapore, which was statistically correlated with violent video games in this data. The researchers point out that if their study wasn't pre-registered, they could have just chosen that trait to make the focus of the study, despite the fact that it's completely nonsensical. It's just a statistical blip that happens when you're looking at a lot of different potential outcomes. So the headline on this could be, violence in video games leads to children moving to Singapore at an earlier age, or vice versa. So is this the final nail in the coffin for worries over video game violence? Hell no. This is a very good study, but there's always something else to discover. For instance, a large data set could make it harder to see how violent video games affect a very specific population. For instance, take cannabis. I mean, literally, take it. It's very safe. There's no ill effects in a large population. But very specific populations of people with specific mental disorders can be severely negatively affected by cannabis. In the same way, while these authors found no link between violent video games and real-life violence overall, they did find some intriguing patterns that should probably be explored in future pre-registered studies. Kids, for instance, were slightly less likely to be negatively affected by video games if they were girls or if they had a positive family environment. And they were slightly more likely to be negatively affected by violent video games if they have poor impulse control. So maybe a future study could look specifically at boys who score poorly on impulse control or have bad family backgrounds. They might actually be negatively impacted by violent video games. So yeah, keep playing violent video games if you want. It probably won't screw you up, at least if you're a girl from a good family. Thanks, Mom and Dad.